On Mr. Stephen Agnew.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. And Principal Deputy Speaker, it's my first opportunity to wish well Mr. Peter Robinson and hope for his full recovery. I think it is important at times like this that we separate the politics from the person, and I have seen some unkind comments about Mr. Robinson on social media, and I would say to those, some of whom I know would be supporters of my own party, that the time to knock a politician is when they're on their feet, making political speeches and political debates and standing as a politician. But Mr. Robinson's like no difference from any of us. He's vulnerable to illness, and I think at this time we recognise the man as a person and pass sympathy to him and his family at this difficult time. My persistent stance throughout this welfare reform debate has been the figures do not add up. I first made the point when it was Sinn Féin who were claiming that under the deal agreed at Stormont House that no one would be worse off. And I made the point that that couldn't be the case, because whatever figure we used, whether it was NICVA's figures of 250 million or the previous Social Development Ministers of 120 million, those were the scale of the cuts, and the mitigation was 90 million. And those sums can never be made to make work. Nothing has changed since March and today, when this bill was first to come to the Assembly, this final stage, in terms of those mitigation measures, which is why the Green Party is still opposed to this bill, and the proposals that are being put forward around it. We have had some information given to us by the Social Development Minister as to who will not be worse off under the proposals that have been agreed in the proposed mitigation measures. But I can't have confidence even in those, in that whilst I appreciate the detail that has been given in terms of the who, what we have not seen, what has not been made public, is the how much each of those categories will receive. Because I know that the Minister's predecessor was very dismissive of the NICVA report, which was produced on their behalf by the University of Sheffield. It laid out the figures. It laid out how much each group, how much each benefit would be cut, and the direct impact on Northern Ireland. It didn't just give the blanket 250 million, it gave its component parts. And we have yet to see refutation of those figures. So as I say, and I often quote the two figures of the 120 million and the 250 million, because I cannot say which are accurate, but I've yet to see from the department, from the Minister, from an official source of the Northern Ireland Executive, the breakdown of their 120 million calculation. And what I certainly haven't seen is any evidence that 90 million would be sufficient, 90 million per year would be sufficient to mitigate against the cuts that are being made. And what I certainly haven't seen, and if we accept, and I can see no other conclusion that can be drawn, if we can accept that if we went forward on the current proposals, that there would be a shortfall in terms of the mitigation, then what we have not seen the detail of is the who will be worse off. We've seen who is proposed to be protected, but we have not been given the detail of who is to be worse off. And how can we today judge whether or not that is an acceptable consequence if we do not have that detail? The Green Party has sought to be constructive throughout this process. At consideration stage, we did bring forward more amendments than any other party. We made clear the areas of the bill that we would like to see improved. But none of those amendments were passed. Indeed, they were blocked by the DUP and voted against by Sinn Féin, who at that point, has been pointed out, were putting forward welfare reform, who were saying that it was the deal that had been reached at Stormont House should receive the support of the Assembly. Last week, when it was clear this bill was coming again before the House, the Green Party laid out key areas where we still wanted to see improvements. If we were to have this deadline today, and others have debated whether or not it was a necessary or an unnecessary deadline, but accepting that this bill was coming forward again, we made clear where we needed to see movement, and it was on the increased funds for the mitigation measures. It was on no bedroom tax. It was protection of children, child disability payments and additions. And it was on the issue of sanctions. In terms of increased funds, we've heard some who say that this is not realistic, this is not possible, this is not affordable. But we have to bear in mind that the same parties have signed up to corporation tax reduction that would see £300 million per year come out of our block grant. The same people who say we can't afford the so-called penalties, which, as I have pointed out consistently, are not penalties, are money going into the pockets of the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society and those in the lowest incomes. They're saying we can't afford those cuts from our block grant. Indeed, the Alliance Party leader, David Ford, at his conference speech when attacking my party, said we cannot afford his guesstimate of the figure, £200 million worth of cuts to public service. But in the same speech, he said we must progress the corporation tax cut, which would see £300 million, a £300 million tax relief to big businesses. And he says that we cannot afford £200 million, if we take his figure, £250 million if we take Nick's figure, £120 million if we take the DSD figure. We cannot afford those to protect the sick, the poor, the most vulnerable in our society. Well, I made it clear then, and I make it clear again, where my party's priority lies, and it is in protecting the most vulnerable. It is in ensuring that the first duty of government is to make sure that people are not driven into poverty, are not driven into destitution, are not driven into further hardship, are not driven to the food banks, as we've seen increasing need for under the Tory government, and indeed under this government here in Northern Ireland, because whilst we get boasts about the levels of foreign direct investment, etc., that's been brought into Northern Ireland under this executive, and as a member of the Eddy Committee I hear it time and time again, well, in the lifetime of this executive, the gap in incomes between Northern Ireland and other regions of the UK has increased. Yes, we've had limited growth, but so is everywhere. That was called the financial recovery. It was global. In terms of what this executive has delivered, the gap in incomes between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain has increased under this executive. So the great boon of foreign direct investment that's supposed to lift us out of poverty has not certainly achieved it in the term of this executive, and I don't believe it would be achieved if we reduce corporation tax and take a further £300 million a year out of our block grant voluntarily. Because we can talk about cuts being imposed by the Tory government, and I'm certainly sympathy with anyone who challenges the austerity agenda of the Tory government. But the proposal to cut £300 million from our own block grant voluntarily is this Northern Ireland executive, which I stand in opposition to, making its own austerity cuts on a voluntary basis and can blame no one. Indeed, ask the consent of the Tory government to do so. The DUP, in its 5-point plan, made very clear one issue they were going to Westminster on: no bedroom tax. Yet, again, the Social Development Minister has confirmed that, well, we've seen it, the legislation brings in the powers for the implementation of the bedroom tax, and whilst the mitigation measures would protect some from its implementation, he said today, "I should develop a scheme that protects existing and future tenants from any reduction in housing benefits for their tenancies, unless there is a significant change in their personal circumstances or they are offered suitable alternative accommodation." In other words, like I've said in previous stages, he has made clear today that where alternative housing exists and where personal circumstances change, the bedroom tax will be implemented and people will be worse off under this legislation. I don't know how that reconciles with the DUP's strong stance against the bedroom tax in the Westminster election. I certainly can't reconcile it. I can't reconcile it, indeed, with my own meeting with the First Minister, who told me there would be no bedroom tax. Because, again, the Minister has put it on public record today that in certain circumstances the bedroom tax will be applied and people will be worse off because of it. Another issue my party has consistently raised, and we sought amendments in previous stages, is the sanctions regime. I think perhaps one of the most odious parts of the welfare cuts in GB and indeed here in Northern Ireland. The legislation that we're debating today, and I think it is worth remembering that it is the legislation we're debating today. It's not the Stormont House Agreement, it's not the deals around it, the proposed mitigation measures. None of them are in the legislation. The legislation remains virtually unchanged from the day it came to this Assembly in October 2012. The legislation that we're debating would allow for an 18-month suspension of benefits as a penalty to claimants. For some people, that's 18 months with no income whatsoever. Now, we talk about food banks, and that is subsisting purely on the handouts of food banks, with no protection for 18 months from the state if you're unemployed or on disability benefits. You'd see those benefits cut for 18 months. That will drive people to destitution. It will drive people to despair. And we've seen examples in Great Britain where it has driven people to their deaths. That is not something that my party can vote for. That is not something my party could stand over. We have, in terms of the issue of the disability additions for children, we have seen some reassurance in the DSD Minister's paper as to where mitigation measures be kicked in, but again, the figures are absent to match it. So we're left to trust on whether or not there be full mitigation or whether or not it would be partial. And indeed, we don't know where we'd be after 3 years. As I said, Principal Deputy Speaker, there's been a number of things that have been debated here today. The legislation, some have touched on. The Stormont House Agreement, and indeed the Stormont Castle Agreement, which I have to say I was not party to, my party was not involved in. The budget, and indeed maybe something that hasn't been talked about so much but is tied in with all this, is the programme for government. I think it's clear, Stormont House Agreement, the budget, and to some extent the programme for government, they're inseparable. These are agreements between the executive parties as to how to move forward, and you certainly can't separate the budget from the Stormont House Agreement because it was predicated on what was agreed. And I can't explain why some people appeared to sign up to the Stormont House Agreement, certainly signed up for the budget, and then seemed to step back. What I can say is my party, the Green Party, has been consistent in its opposition to the Stormont House Agreement, which, and let's be clear, there was almost some sort of gratitude that the government would let us introduce our own mitigation measures, the UK government. And I fail to understand that because, one, welfare is devolved, and two, there was no extra money for our block grant out of which the mitigation fund was going to be taken. That was a decision that could have been taken by the executive without including it in any Stormont House agreement, tying it to corporation tax, tying it to the public sector redundancies. It was completely separate, and then for that reason I fail to understand those who say, if we don't pass this today, that the Tory government will implement the cuts and we won't have any mitigation measures. That is a decision for you and the executive to make, because it is your budget. It is the block grant of which you will seek agreement on how to spend it. The Tories cannot say you cannot put in those mitigation measures. As was pointed out, in fact, the Scottish Government, who currently don't have power over welfare reform, still implemented their own mitigation when it came to the bedroom tax to make sure no one would be worse off. So we still have those powers, and it would still be our decision. And I think those who say that there will be no mitigation if welfare is taken over by the government, I'll give way in 1 second, say so, because that is the course they intend to go down rather than the course they have to go down. I'll give way to a minute.
I listened to a lot of members in the House today about Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon and what's going on in Scotland. Let's remind ourselves what the reality is in Scotland. Because when Nicola Sturgeon was the deputy leader of the party, she said, and this was back in 2014, she said there's no doubt that people in Scotland are paying a heavy price for the Westminster decisions. But the figures show that by working closely with the local authority partners, we've been able to provide support. We will continue to do what we can to help. However, only an independent Scottish Parliament will give us the powers we need to scrap the bedroom tax. Is it not time for members in this House to realise what the real agenda is here and put the facts in terms of what happens in Scotland, rather than to create a bit of a smokescreen for what's really the situation?
I thank the Minister for his intervention. I don't think it takes away from my point that what we do with our budget will be in our power. And if we want to put in mitigation measures, whether it's welfare cuts implemented here or implemented by the Tory government, that we decide how we spend our block grant. How much it'll be, yes, is decided by Westminster, but how we allocate it and whether or not we choose to protect our most vulnerable will be made by this executive, and indeed the budget has to be passed by this Assembly. But as I say, today we're here to debate the legislation. And the first draft of this legislation came to us in October 2012. As I say, my party sought to make amendments, as did the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists, to improve the bill. Little changes were made. This is effectively still a replica of the bill that went through GB. It will still increase hardship for the most vulnerable in our society. It is still a bill which seeks to punish the poor for the excesses of the rich. This is a bill that I cannot support. This is a bill my party cannot support.